It's hard to know where to start today. It really is, because Ukraine is in such a tremendously difficult situation right now. And I spent the last several days here. I wanted to come here to try and sort this out for myself and figure out what's happening and why and where is this going. Is this, our century's World War I? I mean, this is 100 years ago now that Austria has chosen war, and France and Germany and Russia, and everybody starts declaring war on one another. And it just seems that there are so many echoes from the past. And it's hard to know where to begin with all of this, because you could begin with what happened a couple of months ago in Ukraine, but realistically you can go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004, and you can see the early origins of a major crisis back then. Realistically, though, you could go back even further to the time when Ukraine won its independence and the Soviet Union was dissolved. And you can keep going further back and further back, and I think the way I really want to start today is in 1789. 1789, France was the greatest superpower in the world, just barely. At that point, it became pretty clear to everybody that France was on the way out, England was on the way in, and the French were just really barely holding on by a thin thread. In 1789, the economy had become so weak, they had a really bad harvest that winter. A lot of people were in the streets starving, and they picked up their pitchforks, they stormed the Bastille, and there was revolution in the streets. And that was really the end of France. That was the end of the feudal system. And the French Revolution really became one of the most important key events, at least in the last 500 years of human history. When the French stormed out into the streets and stormed the Bastille, and they went to the palace, and they took Louis XVI, who was the monarch at the time, and the family and so forth. They were unleashing a period of 26 years from the time the French Revolution really began to the time that things really calmed down and they restored the monarch and Napoleon had been banished the second time. There was a 26-year period of substantial turmoil. There was hyperinflation, and there was rising crime rates, and there was a complete loss of confidence in the country and in the currency, and systemic banking crises, an external war with Austria and Prussia, an internal civil war and revolution, and not to mention, of course, the genocidal dictatorship of Robespierre and the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. This was not a pleasant period to be in France. 26 years it really took from the time they stormed the Bastille. And just to be clear, the French Revolution is often cited by historians to sort of start the event is they say storming the Bastille on July 14th, but really the origins in this were far beyond that. The people were out protesting in the streets months and months and months before. And some of the most interesting works really about the French Revolution were written by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was actually the primary emissary of the United States in France at the time. The United States was just born. They had won their own independence from the United Kingdom, and Thomas Jefferson was the emissary of the United States in France, and he actually wrote extensively in his diaries about his thoughts on revolution in France and how he would hope that would never come to America and so forth. It's very interesting the way that he looked at the world and seeing the French Revolution through Jefferson's eyes. But if you want to look at the reasons behind all of that, really, like just about anything, any kind of change, it almost always boils down to economics. Similarly, it's why the Soviet Union fell. If you want to fast forward to our modern times and look at the parallels to a place like Ukraine, you have these places that set their entire civilizations up as an extractive society. And what I mean by extractive is that there's a tiny elite that sort of lords over everybody, all the resources and all the people, and they choose for themselves. They're able to put themselves in a position to benefit at the expense of everyone else, right? And you think about if you think about France in the days before the French Revolution, this is when feudalism was the primary political construct. This is the way that societies organize themselves. back then, hundreds of years ago. And you think about the feudal system. I mean, how ridiculous was that? You had a nobleman who was born into some privilege and esteem, and everyone else had to serve as his vassal or serf. I mean, if you were lucky, you were sort of a low-level sort of underling lord. But I mean, the vast majority of the population was a serf, and your entire life was short and brutish and nasty, and you just existed to serve the feudal lords, and you toiled in the fields, and that was it. And you had no rights, you had no property rights, you had a big bunch of nothing. And this is the way it existed all across Europe, in Japan, and many places really across the world. This was the prevailing sort of social contract. This was the prevailing system by which society organized itself. For hundreds of years, it was like this. I mean, when you think about it today, it just doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody do that? There was just some, just some guys who hit the lucky sperm club, and they were born into royalty, and they got to be, they became the king and the prince and so forth. They lived this life of privilege at the expense of everybody else. This is a highly extractive society. Feudalism was highly extractive. So you have these people whose lives, they're being pampered their entire lives, and everybody else is living in the mud, literally. And, obviously that's something that's got a finite shelf life. That's not something that can go on forever, and it didn't. And the French Revolution really put a bullet in the feudal system, because this was something where they said, an extractive society cannot stand forever. There must be a system in which people have an equal right to rise up in the ranks and improve their lives. Wealth gaps are always going to exist. There's always going to be a hierarchy. There's always going to be rich people. There's always going to be poor people. There's always going to be people somewhere in the middle. But that's not really the issue in extractive societies. The issue is the opportunities that people have to be upwardly mobile. And this is the thing, it's this concept of upward mobility that made places like the United States, for a time, the greatest country in the world, the place that everybody aspired to be, the place that every country aspired to be like. This is a place that made places like Hong Kong, so what they essentially are today. There's no reason why Hong Kong should be rich, a rich and wealthy. You can't really call it a nation now. It's a special administrative region of China. But I mean, there's obviously quite a bit of independence between Hong Kong and China, particularly in the way that they organize themselves economically. And it was this reason that, people in Hong Kong were sort of free to sort of wheel and deal and do business and become upwardly mobile. This upward mobility is absolutely critical to a well-functioning society. This is something that worked incredibly well in the United States for a very long time. This is something that people just did not have access to in the feudal system. This is what extractive societies don't have. You don't have any upward mobility in an extractive society. This was the problem in the Soviet Union. You could work hard and work hard and work hard. You could save your money if you were even able to get a hold of savings, and it just didn't matter because the bosses in the Communist Party were going to take everything, and you didn't have any chance to really improve your life. This is the thing that it's fundamental in human nature. It doesn't matter where you are. And I've traveled to well over 100 countries. I've seen this with my own eyes. Human beings are not that fundamentally different from one another. Everybody wants the same things. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody loves their children. Everybody wants to laugh. Everybody wants to, wants to fall in love and be with people that love them. And everybody wants to, they look and they want to have the opportunity to improve their life. There's very few people that sort of expect something for nothing. More and more people, unfortunately, are. But for the most part, people understand it. They work hard and they save the money and they take some risks, so they're going to be able to improve their lives. And where those ingredients are missing, this is where you have problems. This is the problem in France. This is the problem in the Soviet Union. This has been the problem in Ukraine. Since it's sort of become an independent nation after the fall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has just become essentially a mafia state. And I say that not with tongue in cheek. Literally, Ukraine became a mafia state. At first, it was a bunch of mafia warlords gunning each other down in the streets. I mean, this place was just the Wild West for the longest time. You had these just idiot guys, with their jumpsuits and their kind of chest hairs coming out and their chains and their pistols, shooting each other in the streets, thinking they were tough guys. I mean, it was just something out of Scarface, and they thought that this was, this was the way things were, and people just kind of kept their heads down and hoped for the best. After the fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, Ukraine was initially looked at by Western investors and said, Ukraine's going to be where it's at. Everybody thought Ukraine was going to be the new, kind of Russia. They said, this is a place that has all the natural resources. They've got an abundance of natural resources. It's a huge country. It's a large population. And, this is going to be where it's at. What happened over the next decade? They lost 30% of their GDP. They went from one crisis to another. And again, it became a mafia state. Eventually, the mafia guys put their guns down. They realized, we're crazy gunning each other down the streets. The real money is in banking. Why are we shooting at each other for backroom casinos and which of our pimps and hookers is going to be standing on the street corner? That's no way to make money. You want to make money? Let's get into banking. That's literally where the money's at. And so they did. And so now, if you to this day, most of the local banks in Ukraine are either owned directly by the mafia, or they're connected to the mafia. A lot of the people that are in parliament, the politicians, are mafia guys. And it's just hilarious. They've figured out really where the money's at. You take over the resources of a nation. You make yourself in control of the money supply. You put yourself in control of the banks. That's where the money's at. It's not with coke. It's not with hookers. It's not with backroom gambling. It's where it's in politics. It's in banking. That's where the government's at. And it's mafia people that really control the entire country. And so by the early 2000s, they'd had over a decade of that, and people were sick and tired of it. And you had this big election. There was a journalist that got killed, and there was a big election. And of course, people are always, whenever you tell people that you're living in this representative democracy, you're living in some sort of republic, people are deluded into believing that they have choice. The choice is just an illusion. They don't really have a choice. It's mafia politicians, it's mafia bankers that are really controlling the scene. You just tell people, oh yeah, you get to go into the voting booth, and people are actually deluded into believing that they have some sort of control. It's all an illusion. And in 2004, people are given the illusion that they could go into the voting booth and vote for one of these two politicians. And the two guys in the runoff election were Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. And it was just a ridiculous soap opera. Yanukovych was a real, talk about just a grade A asshole. And this guy went out and actually poisoned Yushchenko. There was some kind of dioxin toxin that ended up in Yushchenko's and then there were some people that are saying that Yushchenko did this just as a publicity stunt. It's just a ridiculous soap opera, and they ended up actually they say the election was rigged. Yanukovych officially won the election. Everybody said it was rigged. And so, of course, people go out into the streets demanding change. And they said, we voted for Yushchenko. We want Yushchenko. Yushchenko, he's our man. If he can't do it, nobody can. Well, of course, they were wrong. They had the revolution. They won, or so they thought. Yushchenko went into power and spent the next, several years completely destroying his political base, making every bonehead decision, alienating everybody who had voted for him. And a few years later, when they actually had the next election, this guy that they went, it was just a couple of years earlier, they spilled into the streets. They spilled their blood for this guy to get him in power. And a couple of years later, at the next for his re-election, he won less than 5% of the votes. That's how far he had fallen in the eyes of the Ukrainian people. They went out a couple of years before; they were spilling their blood in the streets for this guy, and a few years later, he got less than 5% of the votes. And who won the election? Yanukovych. The guy that they were spilling their blood in the streets against a few years before they won the election overwhelmingly a few years ago. So now they've got Yanukovych, who, oh, by the way, was a convicted felon and a mafia guy. It's just, and he didn't even really speak Ukrainian. Is the funny thing. Ukrainians would always joke. Ukrainian is their national language. And there's a big sort of the country's almost bisected by the people who you've got people out in the West, in Lvov, for example, who speak Ukrainian. They're very pro-Ukrainian. Then you've got people sort of more in the East, particularly in Donetsk and even in Kiev, where the majority of people speak Russian and almost identify themselves more as Russian than they do Ukrainian. And so Yanukovych was a guy who was primarily Russian, didn't even really speak Ukrainian. He was like George W. Bush. He would try and speak Ukrainian in these parliamentary sessions. He would just embarrass himself with his pitiful command of the Ukrainian language. And people just kind of roll their eyes, and they knew that he was a mafia guy. And they ended up passing some law that said, it was that they had locked down his past, and nobody could go back and look at the past, sort of criminal records and criminal background of Viktor Yanukovych as he was president. And this guy spent the next couple of years completely fleecing the country. And so again, nothing really changed. Ukraine was a highly extractive society. There was a tiny elite that was out to extract as much as possible at the expense of everyone else. This is one of the things that we teach our students every year. We actually have our entrepreneurship camp coming up in just another, it's just coming up in about 10 days or so, really coming up around the corner. Every year we teach our students this. The key to entrepreneurship and really the key to making money at all is just figuring out how you can create value in the world. And ultimately, that's value is sort of it's the ultimate balance in the karmic equation, and how much value you're creating in the world. What value can you create that somebody else is willing to pay you for? To the point that you're creating more value for your clients or your customers and so forth than the money that they have to part with. I mean, that's really ultimately what it's all about. Of course, the other way to go out and create wealth is not to necessarily create value, but to steal value from others. That's an extractive society. An extractive society is where people are, go out there. You've got a tiny elite, and they're toting guns, or even more destructively, they're toting quills and pens to be able to create laws and legislate their way to confiscation and corruption and all these sorts of things. I mean, that's the worst possible form. That's an extractive society. An inclusive society is when there's upward mobility and people have the opportunity to create value. In an extractive society, people don't have that opportunity, or anytime they try, it's taken from them. And I can't tell you how many people I know here who used to be in position, they used to be successful, they've had, they had businesses, they had property, they had all sorts of things that were literally taken from them, seized by the government, by some local politician, who wanted to, dip his fingers in the pie of success. And so they just went out and took businesses. They created some law, some local ordinance, or they just sent goons over at gunpoint to just seize assets from people. This is what happens in an extractive society. It has a finite shelf life. It doesn't stand. This is what propelled people in France to go out into the streets and demand change. This is what propelled the Soviet Union to fall. This is ultimately what propelled people in the Orange Revolution in 2004 and 2005 to go out, because they said, we want change. We can't put food on the table. We're sick and tired of this. We don't want these mafia people anymore. And they voted for Yushchenko. The guy ended up being a total disaster. Then they went out and voted for his political nemesis, Yanukovych, who was a criminal and a mafia guy. But, this is the illusion of choice. You have to imagine, how bad are things when the guy who wins the election is the known mafia felon? I mean, it's just a pitiful system. And of course, nothing changes, right? So now Yanukovych spends the next couple of years enriching himself. I mean, this guy was living the high life in a way that was, I mean, and was so in your face about it. Just didn't care that everybody knew that he was fleecing the country. Didn't care. Was so arrogant in how he was fleecing the country. And so finally, there's always some impetus, there's always some stimulus that creates, change. You never really know where it's going to be. In this case, it was something that it usually starts off small, right? Just like the Arab Spring, right? You just had some guy from Tunisia, some fruit merchant who lit himself on fire. Who would have thought that would have literally created the pan-Arab revolution? Who would have thought that would have happened just because one guy lights himself on fire? Same deal. Yanukovych was supposed to sign this association agreement with the European Union. He didn't sign it. And boy, did that piss people off in Ukraine. And so you had a bunch of students who went out and protested. Initially, it was just kind of a peaceful protest. And who would have thought that, this failure to sign an association agreement with Europe would have sparked all of this revolution? But it did. It was a pretty harmless, almost innocuous kind of event. But that's what happened. These students went out and protested. This started, 6-7 months ago now. They went out and protested, and Yanukovych, of course, sent his goons to go out into the streets. And so the police showed up and just beat these students senselessly. And they thought, okay, well, that's the way we deal with problems in Ukraine. We just beat the crap out of people. The government sends its goons out to beat the crap out of people, and that's how we deal with our problems. Well, not this time. Right? Because now the students said, you know what? We have hit our breaking point. We're done. And so then more students showed up. Instead of cowering in fear, they rose up. And more students went out, and more and more and more. And then very soon it became, it wasn't really a protest anymore. Then it became a riot. And the riot turned into a rebellion. And the rebellion turned into an all-out revolution. And that's how it really all started. And suddenly you had people who they weren't even students. They were husbands and wives and brothers and sisters. And everybody was out in the streets now, doing battle with the authorities. They're doing battle with the police and the guards and everybody who was there, and they were throwing sticks and stones and rocks and Molotov cocktails and I have to tell you, I mean, Ukrainians are some of the most ingenious people. It was like these sort of Rube Goldberg machines they turned into weapons. Some of the weirdest things. It was like MacGyver stuff, man. I mean, they were going out with liquid Drano and rubber bands and somehow creating homemade bombs and incendiary devices and portable firearms and they're coming up with catapults and cannons and all sorts of things. I mean, they're really ingenious people, and they were fighting against tanks and snipers and all sorts of stuff. And I have friends who would tell me, they said, they would tell me stories of their own experiences or their friends' experiences where they're out, this is in the middle of winter. And I mean, you don't mess around in the Ukrainian wintertime. I mean, let's be honest. This is not a place that's known for its balmy temperatures in the winter. And people are out in the wintertime and they're bringing food and weapons and medical aid and stuff to the guys that are fighting. And suddenly you've got some just 21-year-old girl who all she's doing is bringing medical supplies to the people that are fighting. And she's in the streets, and suddenly she looks down, on her dress and her overcoat, and she sees a bright red dot. And suddenly that dot slowly trains its way upward, up her body to her neck, and she can feel it on her face, on her forehead, and it's coming from a sniper. And this is a sniper who's a member of whether military or police, somebody who's working essentially for the Ukrainian government. And this really puts things in perspective, right? Because then you start to realize that all these things, patriotism and national pride and so forth, it's really just a means of control. It's another means of control because they tell you little people, you should have love of your country. You should trust in your government. You should trust in your police, right? Your police are here to protect you, and what a bunch of BS. Obviously, then you see a big giant red dot, being trained on your body from a sniper that's 500 meters away, who is literally a trigger pull away from ending your life and blowing a hole in your body. Do you really want to believe that the police are there to protect you, that your government is there to help, that this sense of, love of country and so forth? When you think about country, I mean, what even is that country? It's these lines on a map that were conjured by politicians some time ago. I mean, what even is that? And then you start to think, you start to think through this stuff, when you've got these red dots on your forehead, and really kind of what a means of control all this stuff is. And it all started with, again, this sort of innocuous incident where you've got this, this corrupt, nefarious, felonious mafia guy who had become elected president of the country, who'd spent years fleecing the national resources and refused to sign an association agreement, just a simple sort of know-nothing association agreement with Europe. And it created the waves of revolution, and that's eventually what happened. And they again, in quotes, they won the revolution, right? But then what happens, right? Then you end up with chaos. Again, think about France. They had their revolution. What happened? Did it become, this peaceful, tranquil utopia the next day? No, they had 26 years of turmoil after France had its revolution. 26 years of turmoil. There was chaos, and this is exactly what happened in Ukraine. There was chaos. And oftentimes, when you get chaos, you get the rise of radicalism. It happened in France. It happened in the Soviet Union. You get the rise of radicals. You get the rise of mafia guys, and of course, this happened in Ukraine as well. And so, who capitalized on this? Now you've got these rebels in Donetsk, who, the claim and sort of the obvious evidence is that they're being helped by the Russians, they're being aided by the Russians. But again, bear in mind, this is a part of Ukraine where most people there don't even necessarily identify themselves as Ukrainian. They don't view themselves as Ukrainian first and foremost. Most of them, they're Russian speaking. Their native language is Russian. They grew up speaking Russian. Everybody in the region speaks Russian. They find themselves probably more Russian than Ukrainian. They're on the border. They're perfectly fine being part of Ukraine. It's not really the issue of autonomy, separatism, being absorbed back into Russia. The issue is just really that they don't identify themselves as Ukrainian at all. And you get a handful of radicals who say, we're going to take this opportunity now and exact our political agenda. We're going to break away. Then you had the issue in Crimea, where, there was a vote. Theoretically, this is what democracy is supposed to be all about, right? You've got free people in a democratic vote who go and they say we want to be annexed into Russia, and Russia accepts the annexation, but the rest of the world says no, we're not going to abide by that. We're not going to listen to that. which is obviously quite a bit hypocritical. You've got some democratic election now that is being ignored by the rest of the world. But what's interesting is that everybody's completely forgotten about Crimea. Nobody even remembers that anymore. I mean, that was just a couple of months ago. That was a big deal. That was front page news, is that Crimea is supposed to be annexed by Russia. And in Crimea, at this point, a lot of people just sort of pretty much presume that they're Russian. And there's, you've got, all the issues with Russian troops being on the ground in Crimea and protecting the Russian citizens there and so forth. Everybody's forgotten about that now. I mean, it's not even on the front page. It's not even in the papers, right? Because what's important is this issue in Donetsk. And now, obviously, the downing of the airline. I mean, just a horrible tragedy. But you look at this, and again, it's like you've got people who don't even identify themselves as Ukrainian. In the middle of all this chaos, they just had a revolution. They don't really have a functioning anything. The economy in Ukraine has completely just gone down the tubes. They've lost so much money here. I mean, the effects have just been catastrophic. You got people here. I mean, the currency has plummeted. The hryvnia has gone from roughly 8 to the dollar to about 12 to the dollar. So you're talking about a 50% loss in purchasing power. And Ukraine's got to import a lot of goods. So a 50% loss in purchasing power, particularly on imports, that is a massive decline. And that's going to hit your lifestyle. That's going to hit your personal livelihood. Food prices, fuel prices, everything has gotten more expensive here. And at the same time, it's not like people are wealthier somehow, right? So you've got people that are business owners and they say, I don't know what to do. Prices are going up, but nobody's got any money. So I can't, even though I have to pay more for my costs, I can't just go and raise the prices on my customers because nobody can afford anything, right? So what do? This is why you've got businesses that are closing. You've got massive loss to GDP. It's the overall economic production is down substantially. The currency's plummeted. Banks are now in looming crises. I mean, banks are borderline insolvent here. The currency crisis, they got a housing crisis that's looming. The government's in a liquidity crisis. All these things are sort of happening at the same time, and you got to look at it and you think, what do you really care? If there's if Crimea wants to break away, if Donetsk wants to break away, but you look at it ultimately, it kind of all comes down to money. I did the calculations myself and realized that the Donetsk region and Donbass in general, because there's Donetsk and Lugansk, basically both of them breaking away. Donbass in general constitutes probably upwards of $2.5 billion in tax revenue for the central government of Ukraine. This isn't something they can really afford to walk away from. If you got a region that's going to break away, it's all about the money, right? It's all about the money. And so for the Ukrainian government, they look at and they say, $2.5 billion in tax revenue, we can't walk away from that. So they want to spend millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars they can spend to go and get that tax revenue. And that's going to be a good deal for them. If you can spend $100 million to capture $2.5 billion in tax revenue, that's a reasonably good investment. Of course, the real irony is that now, they just had the revolution, within the last couple of months. Now they've got a new president. This guy, Poroshenko, he's one of the billionaires. He's the chocolate king, the candy king. That's what he's known for. What a lot of people don't realize is that this guy used to be the president of the Ukrainian central bank. So just think on that for a minute. Imagine if Ben Bernanke became president of the United States. I mean, that'd be about the scariest thing in the world. This guy used to be the president of the Ukrainian central bank. Obviously, he understands, currency and everything that's happening in the banks and the Ukrainian debt and so forth. And it was just a couple of months ago that he was that they had this revolution, and now they've got a brand new, sort of fledgling government. And the people that were out in the streets, now Poroshenko's actually now mobilized, the entire country to go and fight against what they call, the terrorists in Donetsk. And, they've mobilized the country now where they're calling up the reserves. They're even saying that it's possible that, civilians might be drafted into military service and so forth. I mean, this is a big deal. And it wasn't just but a couple of months ago that civilians were actually still out in the streets, fighting against government forces. And now they're saying, oh yeah, now you have to join those government forces that were just literally out in the streets trying to kill you. Now you have to fight, side by side, to go and bring Donetsk back so we can get our $2.5 billion in tax revenue. The whole thing is, I find it rather strange. I mean, it's very, very strange. And a lot of people in Ukraine are really actually quite scared. There are a lot of people now that are talking about leaving. In both, in Donetsk, a lot of people are trapped. I mean, they've blown up bridges and the airports closed. And people that just stuck around and said, "Oh, I'll ride out the storm here," they were wrong. They were wrong, and many of them really have no way out anymore. There's military blockades, and I'm not entirely sure if the trains are running, but Kharkiv is about the closest that you can get, kind of to the action without a military escort. So a lot of people are trapped. A lot of people that are in other regions in Kiev and Kharkiv, and people just wanting to get out of the country because they're looking at this mobilization. They're saying this isn't going to end anytime soon, and if it does, it's not going to end well. People don't want to go and fight on the front lines, so that a president can go and get billions of dollars in tax revenue. I don't know that most people really care about a breakaway region and whether that's worth them spilling their blood and their families having to do with less food on the table because the currency's in free fall and see all their business revenues suffer and to lose their jobs and all these things. Is it really worth it for them? Probably not. Probably not. But in the meanwhile, you've got all this international attention on Ukraine that's really only making things worse. Again, all these looming crises and everybody's rushing to mobilization. It's just kind of ironic, right? Because then you make the parallels to World War I. In World War I, it was literally 100 years ago now that war has been declared, and it was a race. It was a race against the clock because everybody knew that if you could beat the other guys to mobilization, even by a couple of days, that you would have a huge advantage. Germany, at this point was rushing to mobilize, and they knew that if they could mobilize quickly enough, they could get all of their troops to the French border, that they would have the competitive advantage, and they would be able to go lightning fast across Belgium and defeat the French. And they said, if we can just mobilize more quickly than anybody else, the war will be over before we know it. And in a way, it's almost exactly what they're trying to do in Ukraine. So now they're mobilizing all the troops, and they're calling up reservists, and they're even telling people, if you're a civilian and you're under the age of 40 or 45, I can't remember what the presidential order was, get ready. You might need to be called up. And a lot of people are looking at this and going, man, I think I've given enough to the cause. I was out in the streets, my business is suffering, my family's suffering, my savings has been eroded, my bank's about to go under. I feel like I've contributed enough to this. And, now they're going to have to go out, potentially even fight on the front lines again, because it's this rush to mobilization. It's very strange echoes of World War I and a couple of, just a century ago. And now there's all this international attention. You've got the United States now that is doing everything it can to rattle a saber that's not even theirs, right? And so they're accusing Russia of everything left and right, and they're, and saying, oh, the Russians are helping the rebels in Donetsk. Of course, they can't call them rebels; they have to call them terrorists. I don't understand what the difference is. It's really just a semantic issue. One person's rebel is another person's terrorist, is another person's freedom fighter. It's all a question of semantics. Apparently, if the U.S. doesn't like you, you're a terrorist. If they do like you, then you're a rebel, and apparently that's the definition that most of the world is okay with. And so, yeah, the government of Russia is providing financing and aid to rebel groups. How is this any different than what the United States has done throughout its history? Most people fail to realize that in 2004, in the Orange Revolution, the U.S. State Department was funding rebels in the Orange Revolution. The U.S. International Aid Organization, USAID, was funding rebels in the Orange Revolution. European governments were funding rebels in the Orange Revolution. I don't understand how this is terribly different. The U.S. drops bombs all over the world. They attack people and kill people and assassinate people and blow up schools and hospitals and so forth by remote-controlled drones. They do this. They've done this so many times. They've funded rebel wars and have had special forces troops fighting alongside rebels all over the world. I fail to see how this is really any different, but they're blasting the Russians for doing it. They're seizing assets. They're sanctioning Russian individuals. They're sanctioning Russian companies. They even recently, as I reported to you, I think last week, they even took over, or let's say highly influenced the takeover of a bank in Cyprus where there was a bunch of Russian oligarch assets there. I mean, all they're doing is escalating the situation. This is bad for Ukraine, and frankly, it's bad for the United States. Because again, the warfare in the 21st century is not fought necessarily on the battlefield. There will probably be some battles obviously on the battlefield in the 21st century. But in the 21st century, warfare, it's gone even beyond insurgency. It's economic and it's cyber warfare. One of the things that I found very interesting is that the United States government visa system. This is the sort of the computer platform that the State Department uses to issue visas around the world to people who apply to come to the United States and so forth. All of a sudden, in the midst of all this sort of Ukrainian crisis, suddenly there's a glitch in the system. And that's the funny thing about sort of software, computer software, is it's written, it follows a very clear instruction set. There's very few things that could sort of make software break all of a sudden when it's not working. Obviously, with some variables and constants change and so forth, but software doesn't necessarily break. Particularly software that's been working perfectly fine for years and years and years, decades even. All of a sudden now this software that this network, obviously most of this is online, and now the U.S. visa system is down, and there's a glitch. I look at this and I wonder if this is not the opening salvo in some kind of cyber warfare where you've got a bunch of, programmers basically going to, just basically say, hey, look, here's what we can do. We can take this system down. Oh, by the way, we can also ensure that $1 trillion+ in treasuries is liquidated over the next 30 days. I mean, all these things are really big deal that could really hamper, not only the U.S. government and its constant deficit spending, but I mean, even really the U.S. economy in general. So all these things are really very dangerous courses of action. And you're all here looking at this as all kind of happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is, the front line, whether it's, Belgium or Serbia or the Sarajevo of our day. It's really hard to say, but it doesn't look like it's getting any better. And I look at this, and it's a very clear reminder that transitions of any kind are rarely smooth or peaceful, but they're inevitable. Transitions are inevitable, especially when you're talking about the obvious decline of a superpower. Transition is inevitable. When you talk about the end of a reserve currency or the outright change in the financial system, transition is inevitable. Or when a system becomes too extractive, when a system used to be inclusive and becomes extractive, transition, change, revolution is inevitable. It's absolutely inevitable. What's curious is that a lot of this stuff is happening all at the same time. All right, if you look at this in Ukraine, a lot of this is happening at the same time. But realistically, this is happening across the world. There's so much tumultuous transition going on. And we've talked, we mentioned obviously the Arab Spring and so forth. But really, if you look at it fundamentally, economically, the whole world is now aligning itself against the United States, against the U.S. dollar. This transition is inevitable. The BRICS nation, including Russia, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, obviously, are aligning themselves against the U.S. dollar. They set up their own essentially competing bank to compete with the World Bank and the IMF. Everybody from the French, the Canadians, the Brits, everybody acknowledges that the U.S. dollar is on its way out. This cannot stand. And within the United States, you look at these systems where the government just feels entitled to continue spending far more than they take in tax revenue, and it's just utterly absurd. And there's all these fallacies that people, kind of continue to believe, and they say, oh, well, the U.S. government can continue to, to exercise this deficit spending because the U.S. has so much credibility. I find that hard to believe. The U.S. is losing so much credibility. They've squandered so much credibility, particularly over the last 15 years, in endless warfare and dropping bombs left and right and spying on their allies. There's not a whole lot of credibility left. People also say, oh, the U.S. is never going to go broke because, they have all, what you're essentially buying with U.S. treasuries, you're buying the tax authority of the United States. And of course, the U.S. could always tax people. And I look at that and say, that's actually historically naive. It's true the U.S. could just ratchet up tax rates. Right now, tax rates in the United States are relatively low, even though they've been getting higher and higher. But I mean, if you're looking at paying 30-40% taxes, I mean, tax rates in the United States used to be as high as 90%. But if you look at the post-war tax record of the United States government, tax rates in the United States have been all over the board. They've been, they've been very, very low, 28%, 30%, 33%. They've been as high as 90%. Corporate tax rates, capital gains rates, inheritance taxes, and wealth tax, every possible tax imaginable they've gone up, they've gone down in the United States since the end of World War II, essentially since the time the U.S. was the dominant superpower in the world. And yet tax revenue that the U.S. government has collected as a percentage of GDP has been almost constant at 17.7% of GDP, plus or minus a little bit. We're talking 15 to 20% of GDP, and that's it. It's not like when they ratchet up tax rates to 90% that suddenly tax revenue as a percentage of GDP goes up to, 50, 60%. That's not what happens. Essentially, what we're saying is that the slice of the economic pie that the U.S. government gets in tax revenue is almost always the same. The slice of pie is exactly the same percentage. It's roughly 17.7% of the overall economic pie. And in extractive governments, they try and figure out how to take more and more, bigger and bigger and bigger slice. Inclusive governments, inclusive societies say, how can we just make the pie bigger? So the big fallacy in the U.S. is to say, they can just raise tax rates, and if they raise tax rates, they'll increase tax revenue. But again, that's historically naive, because by raising tax rates, they're not going to necessarily increase tax revenue. The slice of their pie is not really going to get any bigger. In fact, the pie itself is probably going to get a little bit smaller. And so that's really a naive thing to say. So all these fallacies that people tell themselves about the United States, the U.S. debt doesn't matter because of our military, because it's the largest economy in the world, and so forth. Well, pretty soon it's not going to be the largest economy in the world. China's very clearly going to take over the United States. In the military, yeah, great. I think I said last week, I'm sure the U.S. Marine Corps can still kick anybody's ass in the world, but what does it matter if you can't afford to send them anywhere? If you can't afford the bullets, and you can't afford the tanks, and you can't afford any of this, you can't afford the fuel to go in the tanks, what does it matter? All right? And I think that became abundantly clear to the rest of the world when the U.S. was basically told to sit down and not invade Syria. And they didn't have the financial wherewithal to actually follow through. And this is why in the 21st century, it's economics and it's cyber warfare and all these things are actually even more important than even troops on the ground. And so all these things are happening at the same time. We're talking about the decline of a superpower and the end of a reserve currency and the changing of a financial system and a system being too extractive. It's become far too extractive in the West. In France, they talk about 75%, 90% taxes on people. It's too extractive. Too much regulation. It's too much, where the governments can just go and confiscate people's assets. And it's gotten to the point now where even in the land of the free in the United States, people now doubt that upward mobility that's become so important, that became the hallmark of being in the United States. That upward mobility now, you're born into the middle class, you're going to stay in the middle class. You're born in the upper class, you're going to stay in the upper class. You're born in some wealthy oligarchical family, you're going to stay there at the expense of everyone else, because the Federal Reserve is right there to conjure money out of thin air and put it directly in your pocket. And everybody else has to suffer, higher retail prices and inflation and so forth. If you're one of the oligarchical elite out there, all you get to do is ride the bubble at the expense of everyone else. This is not a society that makes upward mobility easy. This is a society now that has created the largest wealth gap since the Great Depression. Not exactly a benchmark that you want to shoot for. Right? So all this is happening at the same time. It's happening in Ukraine, and it's all unfolding, just like the French Revolution, this 26-year period of turmoil, and it's even starting to happen in the West, in France and in Spain and Portugal. I spent a lot of this, the last couple of weeks in the Iberian Peninsula and so forth, and it's happening even in the United States. The trend is clear. It doesn't matter whether it happens, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It doesn't matter. The trend is very, very clear on this, and it's important to not try and be the last guy in the room. It's important to not try and time, the top of the stock, the top of the stock market. You want to be one of the people that says, I'll sell when the stock market tops out. How do you really know? I think one of the canaries in the coal mine right now, I wrote about this yesterday, is the Hong Kong dollar. Watch the Hong Kong dollar very, very closely. The Hong Kong dollar looks to be coming under attack right now. They've pegged, the Hong Kong dollar has been pegged to the US dollar now for the last 31 years. They set this peg when Michael Jackson was moonwalking, when Return of the Jedi was the #1 movie in the world, and man, has a lot changed in the last 31 years. It doesn't make any sense for Hong Kong to be pegged, the Hong Kong dollar to be pegged to the US dollar. The economic fundamentals of these two countries are completely and totally different. And now it looks like the Hong Kong dollar is coming under attack. It looks to be like there may be some currency traders, some speculators that are testing the Hong Kong Monetary Authority's wherewithal. They've got a huge war chest. Remember, this is what we talk about. Warfare in the 21st century. It's economic. It's cyber. All right, and so the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has literally hundreds of billions of dollars now at its disposal to try and defend the peg. But they're going to have to look at this and make some rational decisions. Say, is it worth squandering hundreds of billions of dollars of our island's reserves to defend a peg that doesn't make any economic sense? This peg has created inflation. It's created asset bubbles. It's not doing anybody any good. And I think the canary in the coal mine is to see, sure, they're probably going to make some ceremonial defense of the peg, but eventually the Hong Kong dollar is going to buckle. It's going to, they're going to end this peg. They're going to revalue against the U.S. dollar at a higher rate. They're going to they could potentially join and peg against the renminbi or a basket of currencies or some kind of transition away from the U.S. dollar. This is the canary in the coal mine, because when the Hong Kong dollar depegs, that's really the beginning of the end. And I'm talking the end. That is the beginning of the end game for sure for the U.S. dollar. And I think this is something that could happen even in a matter of months. This it could potentially last for a couple of years, but I mean, this is now, we haven't seen the Hong Kong dollar under this much stress in a very, very long time. And so this is something that's happening. It's important to watch. I wouldn't try and be the last guy in the room. Again, many steps that you can take. Be very smart about where do you have your savings right now? Do you have it in an insolvent banking system? Do you have it in a currency, all denominated in a currency that's very clearly going to be falling over the next couple of years? Do you have it all in a country whose economic fundamentals are clearly out of balance and unsustainable? Look to Ukraine. Ukraine is, I think, the modern day embodiment of the French Revolution. This is a system this is a highly extractive system that has come under pressure, that is going through its period of turmoil right now. And it's dragging the rest of the world along, which, again, now we've got echoes not only of the French Revolution, we've got echoes of World War I. This is not a situation that just ends well all of a sudden to the benefit of everybody. There's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be consequences. Many of these are going to be economic. As we said, this is the economic implications of warfare are incredibly important to look at in the 21st century. So be very mindful. Where's your money? Where are your assets? Where's your livelihood? Where's your income? If you have all of your eggs tied up in one basket, you're really taking a lot of risk, particularly if that basket has really pitiful and atrocious economic fundamentals. So pay very close attention to these. Particularly, again, watch the Hong Kong dollar. This is the canary in the coal mine. And as we mentioned yesterday, you can actually benefit from this by holding currency in Hong Kong dollars. This makes a lot of sense, particularly if you're a U.S. dollar-based person, because the most you can lose is about 1.3%. But you could literally wake up tomorrow if they revalue the peg and gain 30% on your money. So there are ways to profit. If you really have got big brass stones, then go out there and look at buying Ukrainian debt. I know a lot of fund managers that are loading up on this right now because Ukrainian debt has very high yields right now. They're getting these yields in foreign currency. And realistically, the Ukrainian government only has its debt levels only about 40% of GDP. It's not really a solvency issue in Ukraine, at least on the government level. It's a liquidity issue. The banks are insolvent and illiquid. It's a horrible place to have a bank account. But if you have, and actually I would predict very soon we'll be seeing a lot of bank runs in Ukraine. That's just only going to continue, this crisis even further. But definitely some things to think about, some investment opportunities. If you're minded speculatively, Hong Kong dollar, safer bet, with basically 1.3% downside risk. Ukrainian bonds, very high risk investment, but potentially higher return. And, just again, be very mindful where you have your money, where you have your assets, where you have your finances. Look to Ukraine as the lesson, and definitely watch out for what's happening, because a lot of things are happening right now at a very high rate of speed. And of course, we'll be there to try and make sense of all of it for you, as we always are. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you found this informative and hopefully a little bit entertaining. And we'll talk to you again soon.